Good Shabbos, everyone.
Shabbos.
Okay. What a parsha today. Lots of things going on. I'm going to just do a quick, although the rabbi did kind of a quick intro, but I just want to set things up a little bit because we read part of the parsha, but not the whole parsha. So we read this Parshat Balak this morning. I would say it's one of the most intriguing and theatrical portions of the Torah. It has all kinds of things that we don't generally encounter: a foreign king, a fearful nation, a non-Israelite prophet, curses turned into blessings, and yes, an actual talking donkey. We'll get back to the donkey a little bit later. But I'll also say that although, some of these scenes, as the rabbi said, they're farcical and somewhat amusing even, there's a lot of humor in this whole, you could see in this whole talking donkey situation. I think beneath these dramatic scenes, there are also some profound and relevant messages for our lives today, some of which we've already heard. So the setup. Balak, the king of Moab, is terrified of the Israelites. He sees their numbers, he hears of their victories militarily, and he decides that a military confrontation isn't going to work. So instead, he turns to what we could call spiritual warfare. And he hires Bilam, in Hebrew, sometimes referred to as Balaam, you'll see in English, a renowned non-Israelite prophet, to curse out the Israelites. If he can't beat them in battle, maybe he can beat them with words. So Bilam sets out, after much divine resistance, to do the job, and every time he opens his mouth to curse, blessings pour out instead. The same prophet hired to destroy Israel ends up proclaiming the famous words that we start each morning prayer with: Matovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkanotecha Yisrael. How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. And then at the very end of the parsha, we also have a piece that we didn't engage with today at all. This very strange story of Pinchas, the passionate zealot, who basically commits a passionate murder or passionate killing of an Israelite man and a Moabite woman. There's been a lot of interchanging between them, which is not a good thing, perceived to be a good thing. And they're engaging apparently in sexual relations right in front of the door of the Mishkan. Not a good idea. And they give you that little vignette, and his whole story is continued in the parsha, the upcoming parsha of next week. We won't dwell on Pinchas today, although that in itself could be a complete sermon. So, what I really wanted to talk about was this whole interlude with the donkey, because I found it very fascinating in a lot of ways, not because of Shrek or because of the report that I saw this week, although very interesting on NBC News, about how humans are trying to now navigate the language of whales so that we will eventually be able to actually understand and even communicate with whales. But of course, they're talking in their own language, whereas most people think that the donkey actually spoke, and the text tells us, right, that donkey is speaking in excellent biblical Hebrew. So this whole fantastical story we'll get to in a minute. I'll give you the narrative, but first I just wanted to share with you a few interesting things about the donkey that I came upon. Speaking of parallels, there are also some parallels apparently with the Abraham story, with the Akedah story. For example, the Tanakh notes that in both of those stories, there's very similar language about Abraham and Bilam both getting up early in the morning to saddle their donkeys, their respective donkeys, which is like right in my line of sight. Sorry, this a little bit. Hopefully you can still hear me and then I can see you better. It's interesting because socioeconomically, one would have expected that both of them would have had their servants saddle their donkeys for them, and no. So this parallel echoing language kind of draws out some questions about, is this in some way a tie-in? The Tana says, well, yes, Abraham was doing it out of love of God and fulfilling God's commands, and Bilam was saddling his donkey early in the morning out of hate, because he's going to curse the Israelites. But of course, we have other, I could see, parallels, like unforeseen outcomes, both controlled by God in the long run. Of course, Abraham's donkey didn't speak to him, but we could argue maybe he should have. Noted scholar Nili Sacker-Fox notes that Bilam's talking donkey portrayed as wiser than Bilam himself, is a jenny, a female donkey. And she says, perhaps this is reminiscent of the biblical personification of wisdom, chokhmah, as female, which it often is, for example, in Proverbs. So for all the ladies in the audience, yes. Okay. Another fascinating thing about this donkey is that the Midrash tells us that Bilam's donkey herself was one of the 10 things created by God on the eve, twilight, on the eve of the very first Shabbat. So in the time of creation, it tells us how important this donkey is, and how foreseen this whole incident was that God had to create the donkey so far in advance on the eve of the first Shabbat. So I found that really interesting. And another interesting thing, especially for those of us, and I see some of us in the room who've been studying the book of Ruth the last few weeks with Rabbi in our post-B'nai Mitzvah class, one could call it, apparently Balak is the ancestor of Ruth, some generations back. And Ruth, this is all from the Talmud, by the way, Talmud Sota. Ruth is the ancestor of, eventually, King David, the messianic progenitor. And how does the Messiah projected to come in, ride in, when the Messiah comes? On a donkey. So lots of amazing tie-ins. But what I really wanted to focus on, after all of that digression, is a comparison and a contrast with another very famous, the only other very famous talking animal in the Tanakh, as far as I know, which is the snake, all the way again back in Genesis. Different in certain ways, mirroring in other ways. As the rabbi said, there are often these stories that appear to have echoes but are complete reversals or flip-flops of the story. Jonah and Noah, Noah and Jonah actually, if you go in the right order. I think this may be one of these stories. And we have a lot of very wise talis that are being cited this week. Rabbi talked about Tali Adler from Hadar. Tali Weisberg wrote an amazing essay about the snake and the donkey. She's in Yeshivat Maharat. And she starts again with kind of telling us the donkey narrative. Parashat Balak begins with Balak. She says, the king of Moab hiring the well-known prophet Bilam to curse the Jewish people. He reluctantly accepts the job and travels to where they are camped. The donkey that he saddles for the trip sees an angel on the road and veers off of the path. Making Bilam so angry, he hits her. After this happens 3 times, and here's the narrative, the donkey famously speaks out loud and protests her unfair punishment. Vayiftach Adonai et pi aton. This is very important. God opens the mouth of the donkey. Vatomer levilam me'asita lecha ki hikitani ze shalosh regalim. What have I ever done to you that you're beating me these 3 times? He says, you've made a mockery of me. If I had a sword with me, I'd kill you. Donkey says, look, I'm the donkey that you've been riding all along until this day. This is normal donkey that he always rides. Have I been in the habit of doing this to you? And he answers, no. And then Adonai uncovers Bilam's eyes finally. He sees the angel of the Lord standing there, his sword drawn in his hand, and thereupon Bilam bows down to the ground. Okay, so that's our donkey narrative. Then there's our Nachash narrative, our snake narrative. And thank you, Cantor Barbara, because a couple of days ago, when I was well into having written this drush, or composed this drush in my head, Cantor Barbara asked me to do the Torah reading, and the very first line of the Torah reading that I did a few minutes ago, it says, now, when Bilam was kind of visited by the aura of Adonai, God, rests upon him, and he realizes what he's supposed to be. And it says, and he didn't go, here's the Hebrew, he didn't go likrat nechashim, kefam befam likrat. He used to go from time to time, where it was his habit or his custom to go consult, the translations say, with omens or with divination, but the actual Hebrew is snakes. He didn't go consulting with snakes, because as we're going to see, and we all remember, consulting with snakes is not necessarily such a great thing to do if you want a good outcome, right? So I said, so nechashim, snakes, is this here to make us have this echo? What happens in the snake story? Let's just remember this before we get to Tali's analysis, which I thought was really great. So the serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild beasts that Adonai had made. And he said to the woman, did God really say you shall not eat of the tree, any tree of the garden? And she says, we may eat of the fruit of the other trees of the garden. It's only about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, you shall not eat of it or touch it, lest you die. Serpent, or the snake, says, you're not going to die. But God knows that as soon as you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like divine beings who know good and bad. When the woman saw the tree was good for eating and a delight to the eyes, and desirable as a source of wisdom, she took of its fruit and ate it. And she also gave some to her husband, and he ate it. And we all know where this led. Talia Weisberg says, the nature of this speech is widely contested among the Meforshim. The Or HaChaim believes the snake only hissed, but Adam and Eve could understand all the plants and the animals in the Garden of Eden, which brings us back to our whale story. Maybe soon we'll be able to understand and communicate with whales. And although Ibn Ezra ultimately concludes that the snake and the donkey both spoke themselves, he also quotes Ajah Gaon's opinion that the angels spoke on their behalf. Other commentaries state the animals literally began to engage in human speech. Okay, so, and she says, although the commentators, the Meforshim, are unanimous that the donkey's speech in a post-Edenic world was indubitably a miracle, no matter how the donkey spoke. Which kind of tracks with what we talked about before, about God creating the donkey as one of the 10 things created on the eve of Shabbat and how important it was. So several points of comparison between the narratives. Talia writes, where the snake uses his shrewdness to undercut his master, the donkey is faithful and seeks to serve her master loyally. The snake speaks to incite Eve to sin and mortality, whereas the donkey speaks to protect Balaam from being killed. Rabbeinu Bachya brings a Kabbalistic idea the snake was animated by Satan himself, whereas the donkey was animated by God. In addition, the genders are swapped in both of these stories, a male animal speaking to a female human, Breshit, and a female animal speaking to a male human, Balaam, in the Parshat of Balak that we just read. And although the punishment for the snake is pretty explicit, the reader never learns of a reward for the donkey's actions. Both stories begin with the animal asking a question, the human responding, and the animal speaking again, she says, and then, and only then, the human seeing something. Remember, until pretty late in this scenario, Balaam is oblivious to what's going on in front of his very eyes. In Eve's case, she saw that the tree was good for eating, and in Balaam's case, the Lord uncovered his eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way. The most interesting thing, perhaps, that she talks about is how these two parshiot are connected by curses. And here's where that reversal comes in, and how the stories are very, very different despite their similarities. Because the snake convinced Eve to eat from the Etz Hadat, the tree of knowledge, God cursed both the snake for his role in humanity's downfall, and Adam and Eve are punished for the sin they committed. The donkey, on the other hand, successfully saved Balaam from being killed by the angel in the road, and the curses that he was supposed to deliver against the Jewish people failed. Given that the snake and the donkey are the only two talking animals in the Tanakh, she says, there is something to be learned from the various differences and similarities. The episode of Balaam and the donkey can be seen as a replay, or I would say a reversal, or even a subversion of the incident with Eve and the snake, with the ending it should have had. A sneaky, irreverent animal is replaced by a dependable, steadfast one, writes Talia Weisberg. A sin against God that brings a curse upon humanity is replaced by an adherence to God's word that brings blessing into the world. So although Balaam is not the most obvious analog to Eve, the two biblical figures are more easily connected by their interactions with these talking animals, for better or for worse. So what do we learn from all of this? I think there are many lessons that we can learn from it, but a few popped into my mind. One is the art of listening. Listen, right? We're so busy sometimes being very distracted by other things, having our own opinions that we're so 100% sure of, that we, in general, have lost the art of listening, which is so crucial. I came upon, interestingly, also this week, something that Rabbi David Wolpe had written 2 years ago, as he was leaving the pulpit and reflecting on being a pulpit rabbi for over 25 years. And he talks about the challenges that he had to face and the disunity that plagued his congregation, which really caused a lot of consternation, and especially in these years. How did he deal with it? It hasn't been easy, he said, and my job has become increasingly politically divided in an ever more polarizing area. 2 practices, he cites, have enabled us to stay together as a congregation. Over the years, I've encouraged people to learn about each other's lives before they explore each other's politics. When you share the struggles of raising children and navigating life, when you attend meetings and pack lunches together, or you're on the same softball team, or you sit near each other in synagogue, for example, I'll say on the adult learning committee, you don't start each conversation with how the other party's candidate is a scoundrel. The second one, though, which is so important for us today, is listening. Listening. We who do not know ourselves believe we understand others. We must always be reminded that each person is a world, and that caricatures we see of others on social media and in the news are just that, a very small slice of the vastness within each human being. So he really encourages us to listen, and in general, I think that that's a lesson we can take away from this. Bilam wasn't willing to listen, right? He thought the donkey was completely out of line, and it was only until God revealed what was going on and that the donkey was actually saving his life that he actually kind of started listening. But the second thing is more specific, is how do we listen? Who do we listen to? And I think there we have to really kind of think about being very, very discerning, because not every statement that anybody's going to make. So, okay, we want to have the humility, the humbleness of listening, and of listening, I think, as the donkey story teaches us, to unexpected voices. It's not only the most powerful voice or the voice from the pulpit that's going to give us things that we need to hear, but sometimes it's the most unexpected voice, a voice from the margins, the talking donkey, who you don't think that you ought to be listening to. On the other hand, so you have to have that humility, but on the other hand, you really have to be very careful and discerning about not only who you're listening to, but the content of what the person is saying, because as the rabbi pointed out last week, Miriam was really, her power, her talent was the talent of speech. And in fact, what Tali Adler had pointed out last week is that maybe Moses, when he hit the rock, instead of talking to the rock as he was supposed to be doing, was being asked to channel Miriam's talent in memory of her, and using that talent. And he didn't do it. Apparently he couldn't do it. Later on in Deuteronomy, he does become, contrary to his usual character, he does become somewhat of an orator. But even Miriam, who most of the time used her powers of speech for amazing things, to kind of set up the scenario when Moses was fetched out of the water by Pharaoh's daughter, and, shall I bring a Hebrew nursemaid? Of course, famous poetry and singing after the crossing of the Red Sea, but at least one occasion, and we don't meet her that often, at least one of the very few occasions where we meet her, what she says isn't great, when she complains against Moses about him marrying a Midianite woman. So even Miriam, who is, so much to be respected and looked up to for her talent of speech, there are times when you have to say, maybe not this time, maybe what she's saying or he's saying this time is not 100%. So the discernment in speech, I thought, was another lesson. And then, going along with the Miriam theme and the power of speech, I think that the lesson, maybe one of the most important lessons here, is how powerful speech can be. It can really be transformative. In both the situations with the donkey and the snake, the speech that's, just coming from that animal completely changes the scenario and completely changes the trajectory of the events. And so we know how powerful speech can be. And we also know that it can be used for good or for bad. And being used for bad can be very dangerous. So I'll tell you a funny story and a confession. A very good friend of mine, Rabbi Diane Kohler-Esses, wrote on Facebook just the other day, she said she was completely beside herself. She had used ChatGPT to try and do some research for her sermon on the Bilam and the donkey. And ChatGPT had led her to a supposed teaching from a Hasidic Rebbe, which was great. And then she said, well, give me the site. And ChatGPT didn't give her the site. Kept asking, no citation. And finally she got so annoyed, that ChatGPT wasn't giving her where this came from. And finally ChatGPT says, well, actually, I don't have a site. And what really bothered, and she said, I was cursing ChatGPT, but what really bothered her was then ChatGPT engages in this very human-like apology. I'm so sorry, and I really shouldn't have done that, and I should have told you from the beginning, and she was completely spooked out. She writes, I think this is the end of humanity as we know it, and I mean it. And I wrote back and said, well, at least it's fodder for a sermon about unexpected human-like speech from a donkey and unexpected human-like speech from a ChatGPT. But I then said to ChatGPT, so tell me about sacred speech. And I think it did a pretty good job. You'll tell me what you think. First of all, it started off with, right away, and I didn't mention Jewish, but maybe if I said, there may have been things in my request that indicated that I was going to be doing a shul sermon, because the very first thing that ChatGPT talks about is the importance of speech as evidenced by the fact that God created the world using speech, right? God said, let there be light, and there was light. So I'm like, okay, on a good track. And then it said the following: when we speak, we participate in the same sacred process as God. Our words can uplift others, offer comfort, express love, transmit wisdom. A single phrase can save a life. A heartfelt apology can restore broken trust. A blessing uttered with sincerity can offer peace across generations. In this light, speech isn't casual. It's a sacred trust, and each speaker bears responsibility for how to use it. And then it went on with the dangers. It's perfect. But because speech is so powerful, it's also vulnerable to misuse. Lies, gossip, slander, careless words can destroy reputations, rupture relationships, and sow seeds of violence. Sacred traditions across the world warn against misuse of speech, not just as a matter of etiquette, but as a matter of moral and spiritual consequence. So I was very proud of ChatGPT, especially when the very next words out of its mouth were about the Jewish concept of Lashon Hara, the evil tongue, and the really strict regulations that surround what we can and can't say in certain situations. We can't say pretty much anything if you're really, really abiding by Lashon Hara rules. In any event, with all of that said, and a few lessons learned for us to take away about deep listening, about humility, about listening with care and speaking with care, I thought it would be appropriate to end with a blessing, which is, how beautiful is the congregation that I see in front of me today. Echoing Bilam. May we learn to hear God's voice in the unexpected. May we be careful with our own words, and may we never be too proud to hear truth, even from the mouth of a donkey. Shabbat shalom.
Thank you. So we'll pack you up and send you next door to do this again.
I'm going.
You've got a few minutes. You've got a few minutes. Yashar Kochach. We will continue with Musaf, with Chatzi Kaddish, page number 184.
Yasher Koch, Rana, for that teaching. It was lovely.